Hello, I can see the live button has gone red, which is always exciting. So that is my cue to welcome you and say a huge hello to this month's Breaking Barriers LinkedIn Live, brought to you by Shape Talent. My name is Rachel Schofield. I'm one of the senior facilitators with Shape, and Shape is an award-winning DEI consultancy which supports global, multinational, complex organizations who are serious about reaching gender equality. Why do we have these monthly LinkedIn Lives? Well, we want to start a conversation about DEI and gender equity and equality, an informal conversation, a conversation that draws in experts in the field and will be useful to you if you are working in this space, whether as a coach or consultant, but specifically if you're working in a big organization, perhaps as a head of talent, or you have a particular responsibility for DEI or your people operations. We want to be giving you something to think about and a conversation to get you involved in. On that note, I will introduce our guest in a moment, but why don't you introduce yourselves? If you're listening live or if you are watching us on the recording, we would love to see in the chat where you are joining us from, perhaps in the world, geographically, or indeed what context you come to us in your organization or your role. Do get involved in the chat, because we always like to follow up, say hello to people, have a conversation. And that is what we are doing today, having a conversation with the brilliant Nadia Nagamutu. Welcome, Nadia.
Hello, Rachel. Thank you for having me.
Really good to be with you. And we are looking at a really interesting topic today. As people who work in the DEI space, we get excited about this stuff. We're fired up. We see it as a no-brainer. But we know that for a lot of people, it is a knotty, complex, confusing, frustrating, infuriating space. And we want to acknowledge that, which is why today we have called our LinkedIn Live, Why Inclusive Leadership is So Hard. Why have we called it that? Well, because the brilliant Nadia has written a book called Beyond Discomfort, Why Inclusive Leadership is So Hard and What You Can Do About It. And the reason Nadia is well equipped to tell us what we can do about it and explain why it is complex and hard is because she has so much experience in this field. She's the founder and CEO of Avenir Consulting, a DEI consultancy. She's a chartered psychologist, an MBA, an accredited coach with over 20 years experience in the field of systemic culture change, leadership development. It's exhausting me reading this, Nadia. It means you come to us with such great credentials as well, having also been recognised for your thought leadership in 2023. You were on the list of HR Most Influential Thinkers. You were named HR Champion of the Year at the European Diversity Award. So we're delighted to have you with us. And I know you're also extremely modest, so you won't necessarily enjoy me reading that out. It means you come to us with a real passion and a knowledge on this topic. So why discomfort? Why did you decide to think, well, leaders are finding this hard and I need to get curious about this?
Yeah. So it came from many discussions, conversations, facilitating globally with leaders around diversity, equity, and inclusion topics, where it was clear that there were things that we were discussing in these sessions that just jarred with them. It just didn't make sense. And they were asking questions, which were fair enough, like completely valid, around saying, well, so hang on a second, what you're saying is that in order to be inclusive, I need to treat people differently. And it's a little bit counterintuitive. And I'm like, yes, that kind of is what I'm saying. But going against kind of what they have been taught, what they knew, particularly not just older generation leaders, but many people have just been saying, well, look, play it safe in the sense of just treat everyone the same, treat everyone with respect and kindness. We're humans after all. As long as you lead in that way, then, and you treat everyone exactly the same, then you'll be okay. But that doesn't actually work when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we'll probably come on to that. But there are other leaders who are also saying, okay, well, I get it. We need to create equity. But how do I know when we've achieved equity? How do I know when I've offered enough to then give this person who had less opportunity a leg up compared to this person who was already there. Like, how do I know? I can't tangibly measure that. So how do I know if I'm being fair? So they got stuck there. And then there were other people who were saying to me, well, this doesn't seem fair now. It feels a little bit like reverse discrimination, where now, as just as an example, white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, men were feeling like they were outside of the conversation, and that in DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, was not for them, and so therefore they were being excluded, and that didn't seem right. Yeah. So I was experiencing there's a lot of discomfort there, and if you go below the surface of all of those emotions you just said, including the anger and frustration and the confusion and the, if you go behind that, what we see and really is that discomfort of change, or the discomfort of acknowledging privilege, or the discomfort of the complexity of it all, or the discomfort of, the unknown. How do I do this? And fear, ultimately. Yeah. So that's where it came from.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to me that because you have the psychologist background as well, that you are able to work in that space that sits around the practicalities of this issue, but also the emotions and the human nature of how we respond to the whole DEI agenda. I should say, of course, that your work spans the whole DEI agenda. Shape, we're particularly interested in gender. Yes. So probably my questions will sit more around that today, but I know you have expertise across the field. But let's lean in, first of all, to that issue about different kinds of leaders, because in your work, you've identified, I was going to say 4 types of leader, but it's more about what lies beneath, isn't it? Sort of 4 ways of being as a leader. I wonder if you can tell us more about that. And people listening might say, oh, yeah, I recognize that in my organization.
Yeah. So I deliberately decided against using a leadership type or leadership trait, which tends to give an impression that actually this stuff is fixed. Either I'm like this or I'm like that. And really, your way of being is something that you develop, the lens that you see the world through, your experiences that you've accumulated through your life, through role models, through messages that have been sent to you. And so I really wanted to describe these 4 ways of being as malleable, right? You might enter a diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation around gender, but because, for example, if you're a man, you have daughters or a wife who, let's just, who struggled in terms of barriers in her career, that you can more easily connect, that actually you might be much more likely to be willing to act towards that inclusive endeavor compared to, let's just say, the same person who might just be less familiar or less understanding, or just really unsure around the LGBTQ plus community agenda or trans agenda, for example, and how we're trying to create inclusion for a group and a community of people who really are incredibly discriminated against and ostracized, but they just don't. That same person might be proof-seeking leader, being similar to just what I was speaking about. They want evidence, they want data, they want to see proof before they act, so that they know that actually, if I do this for this person, it is fair. And of course, inclusive leadership isn't like that. So we created these ways of being as a label, not to put people in boxes, but to simply say, notice where different conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion might jar with you, or might activate you in some way, trigger you emotionally. And where does that come from? What are the underlying values and beliefs that stem from that response? So the ways of being, there are 4 of them. There's disconcerted, where they're feeling like the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction, similar to those kind of white men, cis hetero, who might feel like they're outside of the conversation now. There's cheerleading leaders with a cheerleading way of being who really feel like they are as inclusive as it gets already, because they don't see colour and they don't see gender and they don't see difference of any kind. And then the proof-seeking leaders, as I've just described, and of course the beyond discomfort leader with that way of being, who, despite their discomfort, they still ask the questions and they still enter a conversation with curiosity, even though they might misstep or get it wrong somehow, but with the knowledge that unless they do the work on themselves, unless they understand how they're experiencing the world and how that might be different, and be curious about someone else's truths and reality, that's the only way that inclusion can happen.
I'm really interested now in those models, because my brain is thinking, oh, this is what I ought to be, or this is the one I would want to be. But I think there's more complexity to it than that from what you're saying. And I wonder, within those types of being for leaders, where you see the real challenges. Why do some leaders need more convincing about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is it? I'm sensing some of it's to do with their own lived experience. We can't change what we have experienced, how we've grown up. Some of it, you talked about proof seeking. Some of us just want data and stats. What's going on for people who find this space hard?
Well, I think emotionally, there's so many questions around the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, so many unknowns, so many possibilities as to why certain data, for example, is telling them certain things. So let's just take gender, because we're talking more about gender today. They look at the evidence, the data around the pay gap, the gender pay gap, and they start questioning, which are valid questions, which is like, well, firstly, does the pay gap actually reflect accurately the pay difference between if men are doing a certain job compared to women doing other jobs? Does it accurately reflect that? And secondly, is it that women are choosing to exit the workplace because their priorities have changed after having had children? This is just one story. Their priorities have changed after having had children, and so they're opting out as opposed to not wanting to, And so where's the evidence for that? How do we know that, because we have a lot of stories where women decide they don't want to come back to the workplace because their priorities are their children and they'd rather not. So how do we differentiate between the ones who do want to stay in the workplace and what the workplace barriers are, and whether there really is a workplace barrier and culturally excluding women returning to work and doing what they need to do, compared to those who just don't want to return. So this is where leaders get stuck. This is why they're finding it hard, because emotionally this doesn't sit right with them, because it's not a clear-cut answer, and yet it seems that the diversity, equity, inclusion work is pointing the finger at organizations saying you need to do better, but actually where's the evidence?
That word stuck, I know comes up a lot in your work and this book about leaders feeling like, I sort of get some of it, but it's also I'm feeling stuck, misstepping, that fear of I don't want to get it wrong.
Yes.
You used the word curious as well, that perhaps the best thing people can do when they feel stuck, when they're fearful, is to be curious. So what's the importance of that?
The curiosity is key, really, around understanding your inner voice, right? And we all have an inner voice, right? We're talking to ourselves right now, just an internal dialogue about what's around us or what we're noticing. If we're sitting on a bus and someone walks in onto the bus wearing certain clothing, our internal dialogue, the voice inside us, will probably tell us something about what we think about that person, right? But often we might not pay attention to it. It just because it's always been with us, and it will always be with us, and it just is. It's part of who we are. So being curious about that inner voice, what is it saying about that person who's entered entered that bus, and what are the assumptions that we've made, and why might we have made them? Where might those assumptions have come from? Where are the underlying messages? So the curiosity doesn't just come, I'm not just talking about I am talking about being curious about other people's realities and other people's truths and understand their story. But really, we have to be curious about ourselves too. And that's where I see the difference, where inclusive leadership really is distinct from good leadership. And inclusive leadership is where that inclusive leader has done the inner work and understands, oh my goodness, yeah, actually I have made an assessment there. It's not fact. I'm just making a set of assumptions. But the way I'm talking about it in my head to myself, it sounds like it's fact. So really understanding, being curious about where that came from. Maybe it's usually from messages we've learned and stories we've learned in childhood, things that we've been taught that are just so deeply embedded in our beliefs and in our values that we don't ever tend to reassess them, or consider that they might not be true, or it's certainly not true for everyone.
Gosh, I've got so many questions. I want to take this moment to just say we'll be going till about 1:30. If I'm left uninterrupted, I can ask questions all day, but I want to make sure that other people have a chance. So if you're with us live and you would like to ask a question to Nadia, please do get that into the chat now. We can see that. I'll keep an eye on it, because if there are questions coming in, I really want to make time for that. Particularly if you're thinking, well, how does this work for my organization, or how do I bring this to the attention of my leadership team, whatever it might be. But Nadia, so what I'm hearing there is that sense of some of the work, a key part of the work that leaders want to be doing to make strides in this space is self-awareness. It's that reflection, that mindset shift, which is perhaps not something, that leaders normally are required to do. We have this archetype of the leader, the strong, decisive person who's kind of leading with their head, not necessarily being asked what's going on at a deeper level for them. So when you're working, as you do so often in a corporate space, and you go in saying, you need to take your mindset into new places, you need to, can I encourage you to reflect and be more self-aware? How is that being received?
So a mixed response, of course, because it's so uncomfortable. This isn't a natural thing that I'm asking certain leaders to do. Some leaders are naturally introspective and curious and all of that, and that's wonderful, and they get it, and they're with me. There are other leaders who are quite resistant to it, because actually their success in life has, they're leaders ultimately, so they have been successful, they have been promoted for leading in the way that they've always led. So when I'm asking them to walk a path that is different, that will take extra energy, extra resources, a lot of time actually, and uncover that discomfort and things that they might learn about themselves, maybe that might provoke some guilt. What if they learn something where they've realized that they've inadvertently excluded certain people all of their career so far? I mean, that's quite a hard pill to swallow, and not feel any sense of guilt and discomfort. Now, I try and make it really clear. This isn't about feeling guilt. This isn't about pointing the finger. No one should feel guilty. Firstly, for who they are, the color of their skin they were born into, the gender they were born into, this family they were born into. That is not to feel guilty about. And you shouldn't feel guilty for something that you weren't aware of. Right? Yes. I mean, I think we can all probably put our hands up and said we've probably misstepped at some point. We probably inadvertently said something that was not quite the language to use, might have hurt someone, and I've been called out for it before. So I'm not, I work in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I'm human, right? And I hold my own biases, and I walk through this world, seeing the world as I see it, and also how the world responds to me because of all my diversity characteristics that I hold. So of course, what you can't feel guilty for what you don't know. However, what I am saying is that if we're going to create a more inclusive society and inclusive organizations, then we need to dial up that curiosity and hold the discomfort, right? Go beyond the discomfort. And then when we are aware of something we've said or done in the past, to then take accountability and responsibility to make sure that we then do something about it. And, and if we notice it in our environment, that we actually say something and try to make a difference.
Let's talk about the doing something, because as you say, that there's, and the book talks about this, that the piece around self-reflection, curiosity, noticing our own emotions, responses, resistance. And there's clearly a really powerful piece there about doing the mindset work.
Yeah.
But then, of course, leaders, I guess, however well-intentioned, however self-aware they are, will say, yeah, but then I go into my workplace and I hit real life, sticky, difficult situations where this thought of, well, I should just be fair and nice to everybody isn't going to cut it. There's the whole issue of equity versus equality. Well, hang on, some people might need something different. So I know that you're very keen as well to acknowledge that and say, yeah, it's messy, it's going to be complicated. So the doing, what should people be leaning into in terms of some of the actions they can take to build that culture, to make the adjustments that are needed in the workplace?
Yeah. So there's lots of things that leaders can do to just start opening up their understanding of difference ultimately in the workplace. So, for example, where are the people hanging out that might have a different experience to you, right? And if you're a very sort of one of the top people in the organizations, well, they're probably hanging out at different organizational levels, right? Depending on your own personal diversity characteristics, they might be hanging out in the ERGs, the employee resource groups, or staff networks or something, and really just taking that time to enter their space, obviously with permission, and to with their understanding that you're there to learn and listen, and and then ultimately that's kind of what allyship is, where you're sort of walking alongside someone to understand their experience and then see what you can learn and do. So and that's uncomfortable. That's really, some leaders have turned around to me and said, they're going to wonder why there's this man sitting in the women's network. They're going to think, why am I here? I'm white and I'm sitting in the race network meetup. And I don't think you should just rock up, right? Unless there's an open invite to everyone, unless the resource group actually puts out the message to say we welcome all. But if you're a leader wanting to grow and learn, one of the best ways to do that is to open up new dialogue and conversation and open yourself up to hearing different stories. And then comes the work. It's like, when you've heard someone else's story, notice how it impacts you. Notice your immediate response. Is there something about you getting a bit defensive? Maybe you're just like, I just can't see how that would be the case. Maybe you're questioning. Maybe you do take it in, but then aren't sure what to do with it. Right? Okay, I know this now, but now what do I do? So, and this is what, this isn't easy. And what I do say is that surrounding yourself, I think that if you're as a leader wanting to be more inclusive and wanting to really show that you care, that you want to listen, and you value other people's perspectives, who are different, it's a lonely job. It's a lonely endeavor. Right? And so surrounding yourself with peers or with colleagues who are also on that path. And that's where sort of programs of work like inclusive leadership programs can really be valuable, because you get that then collective sense of ownership and accountability, but also a collective sense of, we're in this together. And if I get a bit stuck here, actually I've already had these sorts of dialogues in the workshops or in the sessions with my colleagues here, and actually I might just drop them a note and see if they're up for a call or a conversation for 5 minutes, just so I can bounce off.
Yeah.
And I really think it has to happen together, right, as one, rather than independently.
On that note of the pieces of the puzzle and working together, I'm always aware that a lot of the people who listen to our Breaking Barriers series are HR leaders. They work in the EDI space, so they might not be the leaders. They might be working with their senior leadership team. They might be trying to get this on the agenda. They might perhaps be meeting some, whether it's resistance or just perhaps sort of inexperience, whatever it is. When people who are at the coalface of EDI are trying to kind of put this out there, work with their leaders, and perhaps finding it hard, any advice for them?
Yeah. So, I mean, my first piece of advice is care of self, right? It has to be, because the work that we do is tough. It can be so tough. And not for multiple reasons. Firstly, because you do feel like you're pushing an agenda that not everyone's buying into, who you need to buy into in order for you to do your job. But secondly, because we're not like in a bubble outside of the organizational system or society, right? We have our own stuff going on for us, and all the diversity characteristics that we hold. So we have to navigate that if we're trying to, how do we remain as independent as possible and hear someone else's pushback against DEI or the work that we're trying to progress, knowing that actually it's something personally that you feel so aligned to and so passionate about. So you're wearing multiple hats, and I think that so care for self and really understanding what's going on for you in those moments, what's triggering you emotionally when you're experiencing, leaders who aren't quite buying it or wanting to act as you would like them to. So that's the first one. The second piece of advice I would say is know who your champions are, know who the ones who get it and they really buy in, and always remember that they are there. Because I think it's easy to focus on the people who you constantly have to have battles with, so to speak, and are constantly having to influence and engage, and they say yes and then they don't do anything when they're outside of the room. Constantly focusing on them, and it can make us feel quite despondent. So focus on the people who are the champions. We can't change everyone, and that's not our job. It's not our job to convince the world, right? But we can work with the people that we have, and there will be people in the middle who are just sort of like a little bit curious and wanting to do something, but might have some fear going on, or an element of discomfort or questioning somehow, and spend time with them. Right, this is where coaching comes in, and a lot of HR DEI professionals have coaching skills. Spend some time, understand them, not through a lens of pushing your agenda, but through a lens of really understanding what's going on for them, because probably there's a little bit of wraparound extra support that they might need in order to feel less uncomfortable around sponsoring a network that they don't personally align, or standing up at a panel, to join a panel conversation about a topic that they might not necessarily feel comfortable discussing. So that's what.
Thank you.
Advice there.
Fantastic. I've got one more question for you, but before I finish with my question, I can see Jen has put in a question. So Jen is asking, you were talking about our inner voice, the little chatter. Yeah. She asks, how can we connect our inner voice with common workplace unconscious biases? I guess perhaps how can we recognize when stuff that's coming at us here is actually, coming from a place of unconscious bias that might well be something a lot of people experience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the inner voice ultimately is our bias, right? Because it's it's telling us what we see in the world and ultimately how we're interpreting what we're seeing. And that's bias through and through, right? We are humans and therefore biased. That's okay. That's okay, because that, you know, Rachel, you and I could be sitting on that same bus, seeing the same person enter, and our inner voices, chances are, will be saying different things, right? Or noticing different things. And that's fine. But I suppose what ultimately I'm wanting to say to people is that inner voice, you just need to dial up the volume a little bit more and just pay that little bit more attention to it, because every single time that voice talks to you, it's telling you important information about your underlying values, your beliefs, how you view the world, your lens of the world, and therefore your reality and your truth, right? Not someone else's truth on the bus, your truth on the bus. And so therefore every single person on that bus has a different truth and a different reality. And if you really look around and dedicate that time to understanding how different, you'll see that there are multiple truths and multiple realities. And that's when you can really enter a space of inclusive leadership and inclusive practice. Have I answered that question?
Yeah, I think you have. Jen can tell us. Thanks for the question, Jen, and some lovely comments coming in from Sharon and from Shalini. Do keep those comments coming. Do keep the conversation going. We've pretty much run out of time.
Have we? Oh gosh.
It whizzes past. But we always say, please do, you know, if you're watching after the event, then do drop comments. All of us at SHAPE are always happy to be contacted. We engage in the chat. Nadia obviously is on LinkedIn and can be connected with. Yes. You can continue this conversation. And I had one final question. I always want to know how people are feeling as they look forward, because you've written a book which is encouraging us to go beyond discomfort, to get to a point where we can have these messy, awkward, difficult conversations and feel okay about that. How close are we, Nadia? If we're aiming for 10 out of 10, where are we?
So what do you mean societally?
Yeah, that's probably like in the business world. It's
in the business world.
Concept, but yeah, in the corporate world that you work in, how optimistic are you about what you're seeing?
So this is a really difficult question to answer, because I think what we do find is that different organizations and different industries are in very different places. And it also depends on who has been leading those companies and industries historically, and how much impetus and action they've already taken to date. I think as we see new generation leaders coming through, again, we see societal shifts and organizational shifts in that a different level of openness and understanding. You know, I'm not condemning the older generation by any means, but you know, it's the newer generation that are coming through just have a different way of seeing the world. They approach the world differently, and so I think that we're going in the right direction broadly. I think that we're still stuck in certain industries and therefore certain organizations, and there are some organizations that can really demonstrate how they're leading the way in those industries that are a bit stuck still, and gain that competitive advantage if they do this work.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I know that's a big question.
It's a big question.
Nuance as to all these things, but I love what you're saying there, and the fact that overall, you know, it may take time, but change is happening, and we're delighted with that. So Nadia, thank you so much for making time to talk to us about Beyond Discomfort, why inclusive leadership is so hard. Congratulations on the new book, which I know only came out a couple of months ago. So we're delighted to have you talking to us about it. And thank you for being with us, everybody who's attended live, or if you're watching on the recording. Just a reminder that these are monthly LinkedIn Lives that Shape Talent run. So I'm here every month. We've got a really interesting one next month, June, probably going to be June the 27th. Look out, we'll confirm the date. But Dr. Andre Bates we'll be talking about AI and gender equity. I mean, goodness me, AI is such a big topic. The issue of, well, where does gender equity fit into that? Already some thoughts, some concerns being raised about, you know, what is the machine learning already bringing in that perhaps we haven't thought about? Are there biases in there? She's an expert globally, so it's bound to be a fascinating conversation. And because we started these conversations back in January, we already have several months worth that you can go back to and watch on Catch Up to join this really fascinating conversation about the challenges, the exciting areas of development, the insights around gender equity and gender equality. Do join us again next time. And Nadia, thank you very much indeed for giving us your time today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.